Natalie Price, a black FBI agent, walked into the courtroom as a witness, only to be handcuffed and dragged like a criminal in a place supposedly built on justice. But the power of the evidence Natalie held couldn't be dismissed as easily as the color of her skin. It sparked a fight for justice that could shake the very system that had long ignored the law it claimed to uphold. Could Natalie overcome what seemed impossible and bring the truth to light? Leave a comment where you're watching this, and stay with us until the end to see how it all unfolds. The sky that day was an eerie gray, as if warning of something unsettling to come. Faint streaks of sunlight barely cast enough light to reflect silhouettes on the stone pavement leading into the D.C. Civil Justice Center, a massive steel gray building where power is exercised through paperwork and verdicts, though not always in tandem with justice. Natalie Price climbed the wide steps, each stride steady, though inside she could feel the familiar weight of eyes quietly following her, an invisible pressure people like her had learned to carry into spaces where they were allowed to be present, but never truly welcomed. She wore a fitted black suit, understated yet sharply professional. In her hand was a worn, brown leather briefcase, unremarkable except for the resolve in how she carried it, like it held a case capable of tilting the balance of power in the city. No one standing along the hall outside knew that the woman before them was the lead agent in an investigation exposing years of systemic abuse within the local police force. And none of them knew that within minutes, a single act of prejudice would trigger a chain reaction that could never be undone. She approached the security checkpoint like everyone else. A transparent glass barrier, a cold metal frame, and a plain scanner stood between her and the courtroom. She placed her briefcase down, removed her watch, and was just about to walk through the frame when a voice stopped her. Not loud, but firm enough to freeze her mid-step. "Hold up." She turned. It was Officer Wesley Grant, dark blue uniform, gleaming gold badge on his chest, stocky build like one of those former high school athletes who never quite left the field behind. His eyes crawled across her, carrying that all-too-familiar doubt Natalie had seen too many times before. The kind of doubt that never looked at credentials, only at skin color. She held up her badge and said simply, "Agent Price, I'm here as a witness for this morning's hearing." Grant didn't touch the badge. He didn't even glance at it. Instead, he smirked, a mocking kind of smile. "You look like an agent. If I were blind." Natalie frowned, but said nothing. She held her ground, arm outstretched, eyes locked on his, as if waiting for some flicker of reason in the man before her to pull him back from the edge of abuse. But there was no reason, only arrogance and the muscle memory of casual disrespect built over the years. He stepped forward without checking anything and said coldly, "Lower your hand. You're impersonating a federal agent. I'm going to need you to come with me." Before she could speak, he seized her wrist, twisting it with enough force to make her joints react instinctively. The leather briefcase fell to the marble floor, its latch snapping open. Papers scattered like a burst of wind. Pages covered in dense notes, linked charts, personnel records, strewn across a space supposedly sacred to the law. Among the documents, a small black USB stick spun across the floor, stopping at the foot of a courthouse staff member. She bent down reflexively, then stood upright again just as fast, eyes avoiding Natalie's, feet itching back as if even picking it up might pull her into something unsafe. A sharp click echoed like a blade slicing through the air as the handcuffs locked in place. The metallic snap cracked through the tension hanging thick in the room. Natalie's head tilted slightly as her wrist was yanked back, her neatly tied hair shifting off-center, but her gaze stayed firm, fixed on the frozen faces around the grand lobby, where power and fear now stood side by side. The entire space seemed to hold its breath in that moment that should have sparked outrage. A black woman, dressed sharply, entering court with calm authority, was still treated as an imposter. Natalie didn't need pity. She understood exactly where she stood. Studies in legal journals had long confirmed it. People of color were 20% more likely to be pulled over, searched more often despite a lack of evidence, and when arrested, typically faced higher bail. In court, even with the same charges, black defendants were nearly twice as likely to receive harsher sentences than white defendants. The American justice system, built on the ideal of fairness, often operates on subjective bias. She knew this well, and she knew. To Grant, and many around him, the mere presence of a black woman in court, not seated at the defendant's table, was already a disruption. Her badge didn't change that. Her tailored suit, her composed manner, her neat hair, none of it mattered against the weight of a prejudice passed down through generations. Grant tightened the cuffs with another click, like stamping out the last ember of resistance in her eyes. As he grabbed her to lead her away, Natalie lifted her head, not out of defiance and not to claim authority. She looked up to see clearly, to look at each eye turning away, each hand that could have intervened but chose not to. Each awkward half-smile was trying to mask discomfort, because the day would come when the evidence scattered across the floor would reach the prosecutor's desk, when the truth would be spoken in undeniable terms, when justice would begin to find its way back, and Natalie would remember vividly who had locked the cuffs and who had chosen silence over what was right, just to protect their own sense of safety. On the worn oak floor, each step of Grant's landed like a sharp strike, slicing through the already suffocating silence that had followed from the hallway. He moved quickly, heavy-footed, dragging Natalie behind him like an obstacle that needed to be cleared from a space he believed belonged to him alone. His eyes burned, not just with suspicion anymore, but with raw anger, the kind fueled by a system that hands out power wrapped in the veneer of authority, not grounded in true justice. The moment they entered the courtroom, Grant didn't spare a second for words, nor the hesitation of someone aware they were about to cross a moral line. He spun Natalie around like a piece of seized evidence and shoved her down onto a long bench by the wall. Her back hit the hardwood, her twisted wrists pulling one shoulder out of alignment. Her left cheek pressed against the icy surface, lit harshly by the overhead lights that hung high above. Her shadow stretched long across the floor, fractured like a distorted reflection of justice itself. Bent, broken. The entire room was wrapped in a stifling silence, one that masqueraded as respect for the law, but in truth was built on something far more fragile. Fear. Fear of becoming the next target. Fear of confronting the uniform. Fear of acknowledging a truth so raw and visible it pierced through the very rhetoric of equality and fairness that the courtroom claimed to uphold. In the last row, a young black man, maybe 18, wearing a loose shirt, gripped his phone tightly. At first, he had only intended to record a brief moment as evidence, a reflex born in a time when cameras had become a lifeline for communities constantly questioned. But when the handcuffs locked around the woman's wrists, his hands began to tremble, not from panic, but from rage building in his chest. He had once believed that courtrooms were the last place where people like him still had a shot at fairness. But watching a black woman, well-dressed, entering with documents in hand, her face composed, her posture poised, being forced face down like a criminal in a space meant to honor dignity, shattered that belief piece by piece. One thought rang in his mind, clear and sharp. Even here, black people are not seen as fully human. His eyes scanned the room, catching the strange mix of expressions. An older officer chuckled, tugging at his collar like someone settling into a familiar scene that no longer surprised him. A female clerk at the transcript desk lowered her gaze to the files in front of her, pen moving steadily, avoiding eye contact like it was dangerous. On the judge's bench stood a silver-haired man in a heavy black robe. upright, hands resting calmly, his face a mask of detached stillness. His lips remained sealed, craft in a silence colder than the marble walls around him, the silence of power choosing not to intervene in injustice. Next to Natalie, Grant remained standing, his breath heavy like a beast that had just completed a territorial ritual. One hand rested on the grip of his holstered gun, as if further intimidation was needed to reinforce his stance. There was no official order requiring him to hold that position. Yet, no one in the room stepped in to correct him or draw a boundary. Each person there, in one way or another, played a part in sustaining the imbalance of his authority. A young officer clenched his jaw, shook his head slightly, and walked away. His quiet steps carried the weight of a conscience troubled by what he had witnessed. But that small shake of the head, in a space so soaked in powerlessness, was little more than a period at the end of a sentence never spoken. Natalie still lay on the bench, her wrists clenched in cold steel. One cheek had begun to flush red, not just from Grant's grip, but from the weight of every gaze sliding past her as though she didn't exist. Her eyes quietly scanned the room, moving across every face, the indifferent, the distracted, the ones hiding behind thick glasses, pretending not to see. She didn't expect anyone to stand up for her. What she needed was to remember, to etch into memory each turned back, each stiff smile, each figure who chose distance over discomfort. Those expressions were living proof of the long, unbroken cycle of a system where black voices were labeled disruptive and black presence instinctively framed as a threat. For Grant, this was a show of force. But for Natalie, this moment exposed the very core of the system she had spent her career dissecting, a place dressed in the language of justice, yet one that allowed the uniformed to act as judge before any trial ever began. The apathy spread like smoke. It carried no scent of fire, yet still clouded the room. Natalie had seen that smoke before, as a child, in the eyes of the security guard who refused to open the door when she fled a stranger, in the classroom, when a teacher ignored cruel names from a classmate, in the hospital, when a doctor asked her mother, "She's that smart?" with a voice heavy in doubt. Now, Natalie's lips moved. Her voice came out low, but clear enough that Grant heard every word. "You just sentenced yourselves." Grant narrowed his eyes, his expression faltering for a split second. He may not have fully grasped the meaning, but he felt the tremor in the silence, a discomfort his arrogance couldn't shake. Behind them, the young black man kept recording. On his screen was Natalie's face, turned down, her cheek flushed, her eyes sharp like a blade honed over the years. He didn't know her name, didn't know her role, but he knew this. The video would spread, and this time it wouldn't just be a reaction. It would be a warning. He was already crafting a plan. The footage would be edited, captioned, and shared to every forum, every news thread. He didn't just want to post it for proof. He wanted the whole city to face one question. Who allowed this to happen? And why did everyone accept it? Natalie was pulled to her feet, but her steps remained steady. Her gaze faced forward, calm to the point of cold, not because her anger was gone and not because she felt victorious. It was the look of someone who had lived through enough layers of injustice to know she could no longer wait for someone else to speak up in her place, because what she needed wasn't a defender. She needed that entire room, and the world beyond it, to start seeing things for what they were. Inside the cold holding room behind the courtroom, Natalie sat motionless, her hands still marked by the steel cuffs that had been removed only minutes earlier. A faint red scrape on her left wrist remained, a small but sharp reminder that the physical pain was only the surface layer of a far deeper structure of prejudice embedded in power. The white light from the ceiling bulb cast a stark glow across the metal table, painting her face with an eerie calm, as if the storm outside had never touched her. The door creaked open, and a pair of black shoes stepped inside, the sound of soles on tile hesitant and uneven. Kyle Dorsey, the young officer who had been stationed outside during the incident, entered with a visibly troubled expression. Clutching his cap tightly in both hands, he walked toward her slowly, like each step carried the weight of his guilt. His voice, when it came, was hesitant but sincere. I'm sorry. I didn't know." Natalie didn't respond. She didn't turn away, nor did she show anger. Her eyes remained fixed on her wrist, where the mark still lingered, where the residue of an unjust act had yet to fade. To her, the apology wasn't what mattered, because the man who had cuffed her was still outside, still standing tall, armed, and arrogant. Kyle stood in silence for a moment, then lowered his gaze. Perhaps he was waiting for forgiveness, or at least some kind of acknowledgement that he still deserved to stand in the same room as her. But Natalie said nothing, and she didn't need to. Her silence spoke with absolute clarity. He was not the one who needed to apologize, and he had done nothing yet to deserve being forgiven. Outside the holding room, the city had lost its usual rhythm. From the moment the young black man left the courtroom, his phone began to share the first images. The video was barely over a minute long, but every second of it cut deep into the consciousness of those who watched. It was plain to see. A black woman in handcuffs shoved onto a wooden bench, her cheek forced against the surface, not because she had caused a disturbance, but simply because her presence offended the man wearing the badge. Within an hour, edited clips of the video were flooding every major online platform. No one knew the young man's name, but the voice he added over the footage stopped thousands in their tracks. Even in court, they still don't see us as human. One sentence, one breath held back by emotion, and the image of Natalie's bowed head was enough to wake hearts that had long slept through the language of rules and procedures. That same afternoon, the first crowd gathered outside the courthouse. They brought no weapons. They brought signs, chants, drums, and resolve. Handmade boards lifted high. Justice for Agent Price. Black. Presence is not a threat. She walked in with evidence. He walked in with bias. Those words echoed through the air, striking the invisible stone walls that surrounded the justice system. The first to arrive were familiar faces. Teachers, office workers, students, young mothers with children in their arms. But within hours, the gathering swelled into a sea of people. They came not only for Natalie, but because they saw themselves in the position where she had been forced down. They understood. If a federal agent, with a badge in hand and evidence in her case, could be treated that way in the very house of justice, what chance did ordinary citizens have? A local reporter pushed through the crowd, gripping a microphone with hands that trembled from a mix of anger and adrenaline, speaking live. In the capital of the United States, a black woman has just been handcuffed in the middle of a hearing where she was a witness. And the first reaction from the people was not to riot, but to stand up and speak. Behind the glass wall of the holding room, Natalie didn't yet know about the crowd outside. But she could feel something shifting, not within the room, but beneath it, in the way Kyle Dorsey now avoided her gaze. On the way, the detention supervisor came to the door 3 times to ask a single question. "Would you like some water?" Small gestures, but enough for Natalie to sense that what she had brought, without saying a word, was beginning to spill beyond the confines of her case file. She let out a quiet breath, not from exhaustion, but because something long suppressed had started to return, like a flame kept down too long, now touched by its first taste of wind. And this time, no silence would be enough to put it out. Under the dim lights of the holding room, as the breath of the crowd outside began to press against every pane of glass and tiled wall, Natalie sat still like a stone in the middle of a rising tide. But inside, her memories stirred, not because of the chants echoing beyond the walls, but from a feeling far more familiar, The feeling of being placed in a space that was never meant for her, then being forced to justify every step, every word, every breath as legitimate. 10 years ago, the FBI Academy at Quantico was the first place that taught Natalie one brutal truth. Talent was never enough. When she stepped into that first hallway, her training suit fitting snug over her slender frame, name badge clipped neatly to her chest, the first thing anyone saw was not her stellar entrance scores or her field experience, it was her skin color. No one insulted her directly. No one used slurs. Instead, they wielded courtesy with surgical precision, needs more observation, has trouble integrating with the group, and the attitude was not aligned with tactical expectations. One trainer had said flatly during a midterm evaluation, "Price seems unnervingly quiet." In a system that prized flash and surface energy, her steady calm made them uneasy. Her silence was mistaken for dissent, not the depth of preparation. But Natalie had never needed to speak much. She had learned to observe, to analyze, to act only when necessary. And maybe that was why Lance Harlow, a fellow trainee, white, the son of an FBI colonel, chose her as a target. Lance was easy to like, smooth talker, steady voice, physically impressive. But Natalie noticed the gaps early. The way he manipulated training scenarios, always handed a weapon first during shooting drills, always assigned favorable positions in defensive exercises. Then came the final tactical simulation, a live training exercise where each trainee had to locate and neutralize a suspicious package planted by an instructor. Natalie entered first, and just minutes in, a whistle blew. She was pulled out of the simulation zone. When she returned, she saw the supervisor opening her backpack, left just outside the boundary line. Inside was a small white packet. Lance stood nearby, arms folded, his eyes a mix of mock sympathy and smugness. No one had to say anything. Natalie already knew what was happening. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. But that night, alone in the dorms, she reviewed every note, every timeline from the training session and uncovered one detail. Lance was the only one who had stepped out of formation during the brief moment her bag was unattended. A hallway camera, though blurry, clearly showed him walking past the bag, glancing around, and pausing near it for less than 10 seconds. Natalie printed the stills, documented every witness statement, and compiled a full counter report. When she placed the file on the lead instructor's desk, the salt and pepper-haired man looked puzzled at first. But a few pages in, his expression hardened. The internal hearing was held in silence. Lance was issued a formal warning, not expelled. Natalie was declared cleared and allowed to continue training. An apology was read aloud in class, but the nod from the training board couldn't erase the doubtful stares that lingered. From that day forward, every success she achieved was scrutinized. Each time she hit a target, they called it luck. Every time she completed a simulated case, whispers claimed she had help. Natalie didn't defend herself. She only did one thing, kept moving. Her eyes learned to recognize who quietly hoped she'd fail. Her feet learned to walk past hallways thick with whispers. And her heart learned something no training could teach, that to exist in places not built for you, sometimes you must learn to stand firm beneath the weight of an entire system that doesn't want you there. Back in the present, in the cold holding room, Natalie stared at the blank wall ahead of her. Just like those nights in Quantico, she needed no reminder of why she was here. The memory of being framed didn't make her hesitant. It taught her this: some doors don't open with keys, they yield to persistence. And even when judgment waits on the other side of every threshold, she still chooses to walk through. Not because she believes the system will change overnight, but if no one dares to go first, there will never be a path open for those who come after. Beneath the dull white light of the temporary holding room, Natalie sat still like a sculpture carved by time and trials. Papers were scattered across the cold metal table, their edges torn and smudged with hallway dirt and the marks of careless boots. They had been returned to her as if they were useless scraps from a search carried out without respect. Beside them, a small black USB drive sat under a faint sliver of light, still bearing the faint crescent of her fingernail from when she'd wrested it from Grant's grip. A silent reminder that while he may have had the power to restrain her body, her mind and her evidence remained well beyond his reach. For the past 7 months, Natalie had quietly followed the threads of a dangerous internal investigation. She wasn't chasing a single misconduct. What she was uncovering was a network, a series of coordinated actions where officers exploited their authority to manipulate records, abuse black citizens, and erase the traces before anyone could question it. It started with small inconsistencies in reports from D.C.'s eastern precincts, areas with disproportionately high arrest rates for black residents, yet with no clear legal basis to support the charges. Natalie didn't wait for permission. She gathered data, cross-checked cases, and submitted a proposal for expanded inquiry, backed by discrepancies too wide to be explained by chance. She didn't need approval to do what was right. She just needed a reason strong enough to keep going. The deeper she dug, the more silent signals she received from within. None of them dared to reveal themselves, but the fragments they left behind were enough for Natalie to begin mapping the whole picture. And at the center of that picture, one name kept surfacing: Wesley Grant. At first, his presence seemed incidental, sometimes approving paperwork, sometimes coincidentally on the scene, or simply the officer covering a shift during a camera outage. But the more Natalie reviewed, the more a disturbing pattern emerged. Every file involving Grant ended the same way: victims unheard, data deleted or disconnected, and no officer held accountable. Natalie once believed Grant was just another cog in a flawed machine, a conservative officer molded by bias and protected by institutional neglect. But after seeing his name for the 5th, then the 12th time in suspicious cases, she understood this wasn't random. This was a design. And Grant, with just enough authority to avoid scrutiny, positioned precisely to influence every link in the chain, was the quiet coordinator of the entire network. Natalie had never named him in any official report, but on the USB she carried today, the name Wesley Grant appeared 12 times, each linked to a case of civil rights violations, a victim erased from the legal record, or a piece of evidence obscured. What happened this morning wasn't a moment of personal emotion. It was a preemptive strike. Grant knew she was coming. Someone inside the system likely warned him. He chose a public confrontation, not out of panic, but to flip the narrative, to turn a federal agent carrying proof into a suspect in the public eye. It was a calculated move, a bold gambit, if Natalie hadn't been ready. She carefully gathered the documents, stacking each page with the precision of someone setting a charge. The numbers, names, shifts, video files, and audio clips, they all lived inside that USB. But more than just a storage device, it was a silent declaration. She hadn't come just to testify. She had come to dismantle the shadow Grant and others like him had cast over the system for more than a decade. A guard knocked, announcing she would be escorted out. Natalie nodded, straightened her shoulders, and stood. She adjusted her sleeves and tucked the USB into her case. As she zipped it closed, her finger paused briefly, then pressed a hidden compartment beneath the inner lining. Inside was a backup copy of the entire archive. Walking out, she left behind the sterile white light and smooth gray tiles. But what she carried now was no longer just evidence. Grant had thought he could control a witness. Instead, he had placed that witness at the very center of the performance he had hidden for years. The courtroom, now bathed in the slanting hues of sunset through a narrow pane of glass, glowed with a pale golden light that stretched across the wooden floor and gently touched each bench as if cleansing a space too long soaked in indifference. When Natalie stepped across the threshold, the room seemed to freeze. Her footsteps echoed in steady rhythm, measured, resolute, as if she were leading justice itself, an ancient and long-exiled idea back to the place it was always meant to inhabit. Outside, the crowd remained unmoved. Their chants, their raised signs, pulsed through the silence like a heartbeat. Beneath the soundproof walls, their presence still reached everyone inside. They weren't waiting for explanations or empty reassurances. They had come for the truth, raw, unfiltered, and this time, unprotected by the layers of institutional disguise. On the bench, the judge stood as Natalie entered, his silver hair neatly trimmed, eyes uncertain, fingers tightening on the edge of the podium. Though he had rehearsed what he would say, he couldn't quite mask the discomfort in his voice. "Agent Natalie Price, this court acknowledges procedural errors in how the witness was received. I offer my apologies." His gaze swept over her face, then fell to the floor. Natalie gave a slight nod, calm as always. No hint of resentment, no trace of appeasement, just enough to say she heard, but not enough to let a belated apology rewrite what had already happened. She stepped to the witness stand. No need for introductions or fanfare. Her movements were crisp and controlled. As she inserted the USB into the presentation device, the room's focus narrowed to her hands, slender, composed, now holding the weight of an entire system. "I will be presenting evidence collected over a 7-month investigation. It includes 12 audio recordings and 1 video provided by an internal source." The screen lit up. The room leaned forward, ears sharp, breath held. In the first video, Grant stood next to a patrol car, his shadow stretched across the pavement. Then his voice, clear, unmistakable, rang out. "If that girl walks into court this morning, we're screwed. Handle it before she opens her mouth." Murmurs spread through the room. Hands rose to mouths. Heads turned. Grant, seated on the right, sprang from his chair, eyes wide, staring in disbelief at the sound of his voice. His body recoiled, as if trying to pull those words back into his throat, but they had already landed in every mind present. Natalie moved to the audio files. Each clip played like a verdict. Car doors slamming, static-filled radios, Grant's voice laced through them with chilling clarity, ordering video footage deleted, reports edited, resistance fabricated to justify groundless arrests. "These were not isolated incidents," Natalie said, scanning the room. "They were planned, coordinated, and protected by a functioning mechanism, from the individuals executing the acts to those approving the paperwork. And the name that appears consistently in nearly every document is Wesley Grant." Silence fell again, the kind that pressed into walls once used to shield the unspoken. Even the prosecutor, usually strict, often combative, sat motionless. Natalie's evidence didn't need defense. It stood on its own, coherent, undeniable, and exposing a wound deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The judge leaned back, eyes fixed on the screen, voice low but firm, as he announced, "The court accepted the evidence. Officer Wesley Grant is to be taken into custody immediately on charges of abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and tampering with a federal investigation." 2 officers stepped forward. The click of handcuffs was sharp, final. Grant stood unsteady. His face had gone pale, as though pulled from a dream he'd never imagined would end. His mouth moved, forming words no one heard. His arms were held tight. His eyes searched the room for sympathy, a defense, some last trace of the system that once shielded him. The man, once trusted to uphold order, was now led away under the stunned gaze of a courtroom packed with judgment. The reversal collapsed years of impunity into a single moment of reckoning. Justice, long confined to the symbols etched behind the judge, had stepped forward and stood embodied, in the form of a black woman once pinned to a bench in this very room. A young attorney bowed his head and whispered, maybe to himself, "I doubted her." Then silence, because doubt had turned to reverence and a quiet, private shame. Natalie stepped down. Her eyes never wavered. She did not smile. She did not bow. She walked forward with the steadiness of someone who had forced a room to look into its reflection, because the truth, once it speaks, carries its gravity. One woman, one USB, one shift loud enough to echo for years. Justice, at last, had stood up for itself, and this time, the one forced to bow was the man who believed he never would. The courtroom doors closed behind her, leaving only the fading echo of footsteps dissolving into the quiet hallway. Some rushed back to their work. Others lingered longer, as if unwilling to tear themselves away from the space where justice had just shifted on its axis. Natalie walked slower than usual, not from exhaustion, but because she was listening. The murmurs faded, replaced by a unified chant outside, "Justice for all. Justice for truth." A security officer offered to escort her through the side exit. Natalie declined. She walked straight toward the front entrance where the late afternoon sun poured down the stone steps of the D.C. Civil Justice Center, where the crowd still stood, not out of curiosity but out of a need to know that this fight had not been in vain. And now, the woman they had seen in handcuffs that morning stood tall, her back straight, her voice ringing clear through the crowd like a landmark moment for an entire community. She didn't step onto a makeshift podium. She stood on the steps, eye level with the very people who had changed her name for hours. Her voice didn't need a microphone. Each word was measured, each pause deliberate, as if she were not just speaking but rewriting the very lines of faith eroded by decades of injustice. I know what happened this morning left a bruise in many hearts, and I know that feeling isn't new. It was here long before I stood to testify, long before I joined this profession, and maybe even before we had a system to call justice by name. The crowd listened in silence. An elderly woman near the front wept softly. A boy holding a protest sign stared wide-eyed, not blinking once. "I'm not standing here to recount how I was treated. You've seen it. I'm here to say one thing. Don't let our anger become the excuse they use to justify more abuse. Don't give them a reason to ignore a cry for help by answering with violence." A few hands rose. Many nodded. They understood. This wasn't a compromise, it was the strategy. A form of resistance smart enough to keep the fire burning without burning themselves down. We will not throw stones. Every brick tossed gives them another excuse to build a wall. We will not destroy windows. Every shattered pane becomes another headline twisted to shame us. But we will not back down. Natalie turned her gaze to the line of officers across the perimeter. Her eyes were not hostile, but sharp enough that some of them shifted uncomfortably. She didn't need to threaten them. She only needed them to see that this time they were facing a different kind of confrontation, one where the once silent had learned how to speak. My honor today means nothing compared to the honor of this entire community, an honor that's been shredded by false reports, unjust sentences, and suspicious glances in public spaces. And I swear to you, I will use every bit of power I have to reclaim it. Applause broke out, first in pockets, then cascading through the crowd like waves. Natalie didn't pause. She didn't raise a hand to accept thanks. She stood still, letting them continue, through claps, through chants, through the reclaiming of a voice long silenced in police stations, courtrooms, and unanswered emergency calls. At the edge of the crowd, a young journalist readied his camera, but Natalie gently signaled, "They don't need a narrator. Today, they are the story." The journalist understood, stepping back to film without interruption. no angles, no staging. A young man approached, hand trembling, voice caught in his throat. "Thank you. I never thought I'd be able to walk near a courthouse again." Natalie placed a hand on his shoulder, said nothing, just nodded, receiving that trust as something sacred, something she would protect with everything she had. She looked into the distance, toward the rooftop of the police station a few blocks away, where the last light of the day was beginning to fade. That light wouldn't last forever, but when it disappeared, another light would rise, because now the community was no longer scattered. They had gathered, and in every struggle this country has ever known, that has always been the first sign of real change. Natalie stepped down from the stone steps. The crowd parted to make way. No one called her name. They simply walked behind her, as if waking from a long sleep where silence had been the only way to survive. And in that movement, the voice of the community, buried for so long, began to find its true tone once more. 3 days after the public hearing, as the arrest of Wesley Grant continued to ripple across headlines and local broadcasts, Natalie sat alone in a temporary office on the 6th floor of the federal building, surrounded by stacks of case files piled high to the edge of the window. Morning light had yet to fully flood the room, but the paper trembling in her hand wasn't shaken from the cold. It was the weight of what it carried. This file wasn't thick, just a few pages of arrest reports, a short preliminary indictment, and one old handwritten letter, its edges yellowed with time. But Natalie knew pain didn't need volume to be heard. Her eyes fixed on the name printed at the top of the folder. Case ID, JM, Delayed Juvenile Adjudication. John Michelson, 17 years old, arrested 3 years ago in March for allegedly obstructing an officer during a traffic stop with no documented reason. The report claimed he had shown non-compliant behavior and used provocative language. The incident lasted only 17 minutes, but it led to John being held in juvenile detention for 3 days before being offered a plea deal to avoid prosecution, with the record to be cleared after 12 months of no further infractions. On paper, the case was closed quietly, but, in truth, it had never really ended. Natalie knew that the moment she saw the name of the lead officer on the report, Wesley Grant. She followed the faint ink markings in the paperwork and found the last known contact for family, Deborah Michelson, John's mother. But a single red note beside her name made Natalie's breath hitch. Deceased, self-inflicted. Stillness fell. Natalie sat motionless, her fingers hovering over the line as if trying to hold on to something not yet gone. Not because she hadn't seen files like this before, but this time, the story was tied to a name she recognized. She remembered seeing John Michelson's name once in an old email from a nonprofit, Safe Futures, an organization supporting families impacted by systemic violence. This time, Natalie made the call herself. The director, a woman named Mara Kingston, spoke with a steady, low voice, which cracked slightly when Natalie mentioned Deborah's name. "She sent us a journal after it all happened." Mara paused, then added, "We kept it. We never shared it. But if it can help you get justice for them, I think it's time." 3 hours later, Natalie received an express package, a small brown leather-bound notebook, hand-stitched, its corners frayed. Every page carried slanted handwriting, as if written by someone who once taught children how to write. But every line, every paragraph, was carved with unfiltered despair. March 14th. John was arrested yesterday. They said he mouthed off to an officer. I asked, "Is there a camera?" They said it malfunctioned. They said if I stayed quiet, they'd help. I just needed my son home, so I nodded. But since that day, he hasn't looked at me the same. March 22nd. They said the record would be cleared in a year. But today, the school sent a letter rejecting his honors application. Conduct to history under review. I saw the teacher's face, the kind that says I raised a criminal. When I walk outside, I hear the neighbors whisper. I know what they think. April 9th. John skipped breakfast. He avoids me. I asked, "Are you okay?" He said, "I don't want to live in this city anymore." April 12th. I dreamed I walked into the police station, laid out every piece of evidence, and stood in front of each one of them. Then I woke up, and I was still just a black mother in public housing, judged by my zip code. I used to think justice was something you could call for. Now I think maybe justice only listens to those who are wide enough to be heard. Natalie closed the notebook as dusk fell. Outside the window, patrol cars still pass the main street. Flashing lights once seen as symbols of safety now stirred something more anxious than reassuring. She stood, walked to the filing cabinet, and pulled the investigation records from that year. And, just as she suspected, Grant's name appeared again, signed beneath the arrest confirmation, also listed as the approving officer for a non-traditional intervention strategy for juveniles with potentially disruptive behavior. Everything had been formalized. Everything appeared justified, and that made it all the more brutal. This was no longer just an investigation into systemic abuse. This was a response to a mother who once believed justice might say her son's name, and who collapsed into despair when she realized the system was designed to ensure she never got to dream of that hope in the first place. And that was the reason Natalie couldn't stop. Since that afternoon, when Natalie laid her hand on the worn wooden desk inside the nonprofit office, where Deborah Michelson's journal had stilled every nerve in her body, she had not appeared in public again. No follow-up speeches, no national TV interviews, despite repeated invitations from major news outlets. Editors from the biggest media houses in the country kept calling her office, but each request was turned away by her assistant with a single line. "Agent Price is currently focused on the investigation." Natalie didn't seek the spotlight. She knew that if the light turned on too soon, it might blind the very truth it was supposed to illuminate. The files, the records, the hidden threads that needed exposure, not applause. But even in silence, Natalie could no longer walk through the city unnoticed. From the handwritten signs hung outside the courthouse gates to the lines of people forming along central avenues, it was clear she had become what she once tried to avoid, a symbol. A little girl in a red beret clutched her mother's coat and looked up as Natalie entered the room for the internal hearing. A young man with glasses handed her a letter from his grandmother, once arrested for protesting the Vietnam War, who wrote, "You are not alone." These small gestures, quiet but constant, wove an invisible thread that tethered Natalie to a question that haunted her. Did real change begin with investigations, or with the eyes that refused to stop watching her? Though she stayed away from cameras, her image still appeared across every major publication. But it wasn't just for exposing a police officer during a live hearing, it was for how she had done it, without bitterness, without calls for vengeance, without sowing division. And that, more than anything, was what made those in power uneasy. A black woman, dragged, demeaned, in a place meant to uphold the law, refused to play by the rules of rage. Her composure was not complying. It was resistance with staying power. The city began to shift in strange ways. Crowds outside the D.C. The Civil Justice Center grew larger by the day, yet remained orderly. No shattered windows, no overturned cars. Protesters carried books, flowers, and handwritten letters written in the language of legacy, a demand for the right to exist without suspicion. Sometimes school children stood at the steps and sang, "Lift every voice and sing," and their voices would echo off the courthouse stone like a reminder. They weren't standing here for one woman, they were standing here for all. Natalie received an email from the head of the city council. He called her actions a resonance beyond political forecast. He didn't say, "Thank you," but the very fact that such an email existed, within a system once defined by its silence, was a sign of motion. Major newspapers began covering the case in greater depth. But this time they weren't just writing about Natalie. They were writing about the system that had created more Deborah Michelsons, more boys like John, and more women who entered courtrooms with valid documents only to be dismissed by the weight of old prejudice. Something strange began to unfold. The crowd's peacefulness made the authorities nervous. There was no riot to suppress, no excuse to crack down. Every act of protest fell within the rule of law, and that alone forced a question to rise. When justice is misused, does silence remain a virtue? When protests don't destroy, who is truly disrupting order? Natalie didn't know if change would come soon, but she understood that the moment those silent footsteps returned to the courthouse each day, a truth had been affirmed. No one was willing to look away anymore. One evening, returning to her small apartment on the edge of Capitol Hill, Natalie found a slip of paper tucked under her door. It wasn't a threat, nor was it praise. Just a few lines, written in a steady hand. You don't need to stand on the highest platform for us to see you. Just keep walking. We are behind you. Natalie folded the note and placed it in the drawer where she kept Deborah's journal. She didn't need front pages. She didn't need multi-part interviews, because real change, for her, never started on a stage. It started in the eyes of a mother who lost her son to a false charge, in the soft voices of children singing, where justice once turned away, and in the quiet ache inside thousands of Americans who now knew if they didn't speak now, they risked losing the last part of their humanity. Natalie Price had become a symbol, but not because she wanted to be. Because in a society where fairness was often priced by skin tone, silence was no longer an option. And from that silence, a tremor had begun to spread, not through rage, but through truth, not through slogans, but through trust that had once been broken and was now being slowly rebuilt. The days that followed passed with an uncanny rhythm. Each moment felt like waiting, like the still surface of a lake before a storm. News about Natalie Price slowly faded from the front pages, but it wasn't disappearance, it was the quiet before a shift. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. Not one aimed at a single officer like Wesley Grant, but one directed squarely at the system that had protected him. Natalie understood that silence. She chose to work in an old conference room in the basement of a building that once housed a regional FBI office. Its walls were raw brick, lit by a dull yellow light, with a faint hum from aging ventilation. The printer coughed out faded sheets slowly. The space lacked comfort, but was perfect for her purpose. A place where no wall was thick enough to conceal the truth. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday morning, not in a grand auditorium, not from behind a podium flanked by flags. She chose the community hall in Ward 7, a place that had once drawn just a handful of residents to meetings about streetlight maintenance, now packed to the walls. People arrived with cameras, phones, and notepads, but Natalie knew this time. No device was needed to preserve what she was about to reveal. It would burn itself into memory. She stepped up to the podium. No greeting, just a solemn look and a voice measured like a slow-moving verdict. What you're about to hear is what they said when they thought no one was listening. The screen behind her glowed to life. The first sound came muffled with radio static. We need to hit our arrest quota. At least 40 this quarter. Focus on the Northeast. Black males, old cars, just log it as suspicious behavior. Another voice chimed in, flat, like reading off inventory. And resisting arrest? We can always find a way to add that. A woman in the third row clutched her chest, eyes wide, unblinking. The room was so still, you could hear the projector whirring. Natalie signaled for the next clip, a recording from another internal meeting. Laughter erupted, cold and casual. That girl the other day, Natalie something, should have handled her sooner. Grant warned y'all, but you thought it was personal." A second voice joined. "Now she's got evidence. Might have to scrub some files." The first laughed again. "Then just make new ones." No one moved. The air was tight, as if everyone was holding their breath to keep from interrupting the confession unraveling before them. Natalie waited a beat, then cut the audio. That was enough. The words, unedited, raw, had painted a portrait of a machine fluent in manufacturing guilt and silencing dissent. Her gaze swept the room, her voice sharp as a thin blade through mist. "Among those pulled into this machine, I want you to remember one name: Jordan Holloway, 17. Arrested 3 years ago for wandering at night with a non-compliant attitude. No drugs, no weapons, no matching witness statements. Yet he was detained overnight and pressured into a plea. That night, Jordan was beaten and told, 'You'll never see your mom again if you don't cooperate.'" The screen shifted to his image. Thin face, puffy eyes, messy hair. A teenager buried among hundreds of case files, now undeniable proof of a system fueled by fear. Natalie placed her hand on the podium. Each word landed like a stone. His mother, Deborah Holloway, a night shift nurse, single mother, wrote more than 10 letters to the Department of Justice, demanding the truth. No response. 6 months later, she quit her job, spiraled into depression, and hung herself in their one-bedroom apartment, leaving behind a handwritten note. "If I disappear, will anyone still hear my son?" No tears came from Natalie. Her voice remained steady. But in that steadiness, the room collapsed into quiet devastation. A man covered his face. A woman clutched her child's hand. A college student with shoulder-length hair nodded slowly, as if she had once been another Jordan, spared only by chance. Natalie bowed her head. Silence stretched. "I'm not standing here to prove I was right. I'm here to declare this truth belongs to them, the ones with no microphones, no attorneys, no chances." Applause started from the back row, then rolled forward like waves. Natalie stepped down, didn't bow, didn't smile. She walked past the front row where a man in a faded work uniform sat quietly. He was Jordan's uncle, and for the first time, he had heard his nephew's name spoken in public with dignity. Natalie pushed open the door to the hall and stepped outside. Noon sunlight stretched across the gritty concrete. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. Because this journey, though others had been lost along the way, was not yet over. It would continue through her. The term Monroe Inquiry first appeared in a federal memo as a placeholder, a technical label for an internal review. But once the document was signed and sealed, the name began to carry something heavier: the weight of expectation, of justice long delayed, and of a promise made at the edge of broken trust. Natalie hadn't asked to lead. But in the emergency meeting with the Department of Justice, she was the only one with enough evidence, experience, and public backing to leave no room for objection. She accepted the role not out of ambition, but out of duty. A federal investigation encompassing the entire D.C., the police department, and several surrounding jurisdictions, areas with recurring allegations of discrimination, record tampering, and civil rights violations, was officially launched. The name of the inquiry remained as a reminder that this journey began with a mother, Deborah Holloway, who left the world believing no one would ever listen to her son. Alongside Natalie stood attorney Audrey Mills, a white woman with steel-gray hair, a voice sharp as a chisel, and a mind honed like a saw blade. Once an international human rights specialist, Audrey had returned to the U.S. after a landmark case in Haiti, realizing that even here, in her own country, there were forgotten victims no less deserving of justice. The combination of Natalie and Audrey didn't just make for a formidable team, It symbolized something the system had rarely seen. Two women from entirely different worlds standing on the same side of what was right, not for revenge, but for repair. In the early days, the investigation team received stacks of documents, arrests with no clear cause, prolonged detentions with no attorney notification, and internal reports that had been shelved as handled by protocol, now pulled apart line by line. And what was most astonishing, from the shadows of a once silenced department, new voices were beginning to rise. A young officer named Malik Torres, formerly a night patrolman in East D.C., requested a closed hearing. He brought with him a notebook he had kept for over 2 years, documenting every time he was instructed to stop someone without cause, every instance he was told to charge someone with disorderly conduct before they'd even spoken. His notes included dates, times, locations, and even transcripts of conversations with his superiors. In the hearing, he said, "I couldn't sleep. I used to think staying silent meant protecting my career. Now I know silence is how I kill a part of myself." Not long after, 3 more individuals, 2 of them women, came forward to testify. They had worked in data archives and discovered multiple internal video files edited before being released to external oversight. One of them, a single mother afraid of being fired, wrote in her witness request, "I don't want my daughter to grow up knowing her mother saw the truth and looked away." Every testimony was meticulously recorded. Every piece of evidence is verified by at least 2 independent parties. The task force worked around the clock, turning their temporary office into a war room, whiteboards layered with names, timelines, neighborhood maps, and the faces of individuals erased from official records. Public opinion began to shift. At first, people came just to observe, wondering how far Natalie could go. But as news outlets started reporting details from the inquiry, entire communities once labeled high risk began sending letters of support, along with old files they had kept for years, never expecting anyone to believe them. A high school teacher brought in a photocopy of a grade book that was confiscated by police after she refused to sign a statement accusing a student of chronic defiance. An elderly street vendor submitted a 2013 citation that listed only this reason: creates a sense of threat through demeanor. In one meeting, Audrey spoke bluntly to federal officials. "We're not trying to tear down a system. We're trying to help it self-correct before the people decide to dismantle it themselves." The investigation pressed on. Within the first month, over 30 cases were reopened. 12 subpoenas were issued to police departments, and 3 special hearings were convened with state lawmakers present. And amid the whirlwind of data, testimonies, and evidence, Natalie was still the first to arrive each morning, not out of routine, but because conviction had never left her heart. Once, walking through a quiet corridor of the inquiry headquarters, she crossed paths with Kyle Dorsey, the young officer who had once apologized to her in the holding room. Now he was one of the lead coordinators on the data team. He greeted her with a voice both awkward and relieved. "I guess we're finally doing the right thing," Natalie answered with a simple nod. But something had changed in her eyes. The fire that once burned quietly now spread into places long extinguished of hope. The Monroe inquiry was no longer just a name on a form. It was a turning point in a nation confronting its reflection through the eyes of those it had cast aside, and the voice of a woman once handcuffed in the House of Justice. And this time, the one knocking on the system's door was the one it had once tried to push out. The message came in late afternoon, just hours after Natalie approved the 30-second case file under the Monroe inquiry. A single, cold line with no subject, Level 4, Internal Report, Summon Agent Price, Strict Confidentiality. Attached was an address, an unmarked conference room under the Department of Homeland Security, absent from any federal calendar. When Natalie arrived, The steel door slammed shut behind her like a warning. This room was not for conversation. It was for commands. 6 people sat inside, all in gray suits, name tags covered with black tape. No introductions, no hostility. Just the unmistakable posture that told her she wasn't there to speak. One of them, a hoarse voice, eyes cold, began, "The Monroe inquiry is severely damaging institutional credibility. We've received requests from several states to suspend access to case records. The media is distorting the process, turning the investigation into public persecution. We need you to de-escalate." Natalie sat straight, hands folded. She waited, then responded, her voice low and steady like waves against a break wall. "Gentlemen, what makes people lose faith isn't the investigation. It's what it reveals. If institutional trust can only survive under the weight of buried truths, then perhaps what we're defending is misnamed." Silence followed. Then, a tap from the man at the head of the table, pen against wood, as if sealing a decision already made. A few hours later, the reassignment order arrived at the Monroe Inquiry Office. According to the official directive, Natalie was to provide technical support at the Interagency Data Coordination Center for Region 3, a remote office on the Maryland outskirts, tasked with aggregating legacy federal data sets. Her title remained. She was still an agent, but her authority to issue directives was removed. Her signature no longer appeared on outgoing files, and her access to classified Monroe inquiry materials was revoked. All communications were rerouted to an interim operations lead. Some news outlets called it a temporary strategic adjustment, but everyone in the system knew what it was: a dilution of influence, a quiet sidelining of someone who couldn't be publicly punished but who they could not allow to keep shaping the narrative. Her first days at the new office were colorless. Gray concrete halls, harsh fluorescent lighting, endless stacks of cold, untouched files. No one expected anything from her. The staff, mostly data analysts and part-time agents, greeted her with tentative glances, as if her very presence reminded them that even they could be pushed to the fringes if they ever dared to speak. But Natalie hadn't come to rest. She spent those first days combing through the archive, forgotten spreadsheets, never cross-referenced data trails, trimmed down reports marked insufficient for review. Amid those dry documents, she spotted a pattern, not just in D.C., but spreading to neighboring states like Virginia, Delaware, and even suburban districts in New Jersey. A repeating structure: vague arrest orders, short-term detentions, unrecorded, case closures marked as handled internally. She began calling people, former colleagues, young investigators who had messaged her after the Monroe hearing. No promises, no pressure, just a simple question: do you still want to know the truth? Slowly, a group began to form. Not an official task force, no badge, no formal meetings. Just people willing to give up lunch breaks to read each other's notes. People who dared to add a single comment to a closed report asking, why don't the arrest time, date, and location match? Among them was Elijah, a 24-year-old data tech who dropped out of school after watching his best friend being beaten in a detention center. Rosa, a Puerto Rican photo archivist who discovered a batch of malfunctioned body cams, all of which still held usable footage. And Jenna, a law student who had almost quit the profession after losing faith in the system, is now volunteering to read the things no one else wants to. Natalie called them the Justice Unit, not because they had power, but because they had purpose. They had no budget, no legal shield, but they held something too many institutions had lost: the belief that change was possible if it started from the inside. One evening, as the season turned to winter, Natalie stepped out of the office and looked toward the distant outline of the mountains. The cold air hit her face, cutting through her coat. But inside, she felt warmth, not from victory, but from no longer standing alone. The system might have pushed her out of its center, but from the margins, she was resetting the direction of the wind. And wind, no matter how blocked, always finds a way to blow through locked doors. The Justice Unit, small, silent, was becoming a new current beneath the surface, and Natalie, once handcuffed in a courtroom, was now the one charting the course for a generation who believed that to change a system, sometimes, you had to begin from within. Late on a weekend afternoon, Natalie found an unmarked envelope tucked neatly inside her drawer at the data center. No one had seen who left it. There was no sign of tampering. The paper was slightly creased, as if it had traveled far. On the edge, a single word was smeared in red ink: Quantico. Inside were copies of 3 internal case files marked restricted, not for redistribution, not logged in the official system. Each one involved exceptional cases of arrest dating back 5 years, and each carried eerily similar details. Suspects were people of color, with no criminal record, held for resisting official procedure, released within 48 hours, and the cases were quietly closed without trial. What stopped Natalie cold was a handwritten line at the end of each copy, in black ink, slanted slightly rightward, a habit she knew all too well. You were right. This time, I'm choosing right. She read it over and over. No signature, no explanation. She didn't need either. She knew exactly who had written it: Lance Harlow. Back at Quantico, Lance had been a top-tier trainee, sharp, quick, the kind instructors pointed to as a model. But he had also been the one to hide evidence in Natalie's bag, trying to sabotage her place in the tactical exam. Behind the friendly facade had always been a deep discomfort with a black woman occupying a space he believed didn't need any more diversity. Natalie had reversed that sabotage with a counter-investigation that forced a disciplinary hearing. Lance wasn't expelled, but his stand-in was downgraded, and he had to repeat a semester. They never spoke again. And now, that same man was handing her proof to go deeper into the system. 3 days later, they met in a cafe just outside Alexandria. It was the first time in 8 years. Lance arrived slightly late, dressed in plain clothes, carrying in himself with less of the cocky stride she remembered. His eyes were shadowed, his voice lower, and the arrogance had left his gaze. He sat down, placed a folder on the table, and stayed silent for a few seconds before speaking. I was a coward. Back at Quantico, I wasn't afraid of you. I was afraid of what you represented. Natalie said nothing. She didn't need to. I used to believe America was still good enough for my daughter to grow up without ever having to bow her head. But then she asked her mother, "Has Dad ever arrested someone who didn't do anything wrong?" I didn't know what to say. I thought I'd just stayed out of it. But now I know staying out is still choosing a side. He spoke of his years in tactical coordination units where strategy meetings used phrases spoken softly but loaded with meaning. Priority precincts, susceptible groups engaged through presence. He got used to the way the system hinted rather than ordered, how everyone knew what to do to move up smoothly. They trusted me because they thought I was like them. And I was, Lance admitted, taking a deep breath. But I don't want my kid to grow up in a country where skin color decides how you get treated. I want her to trust the police, not fear them. Natalie looked at him for the first time, not seeing performative remorse, but the raw anxiety of a father trying to unlearn the world he once upheld. The documents he handed over included internal directives never publicly released, and reports from rapid intervention pilot units, a covert initiative being tested in multiple states to ease court congestion through on-site adjudication. In these programs, officers had sole discretion over detentions, and Lance had seen it used to target those the system deemed disruptive to traditional order. Natalie accepted the folder, her hands heavy with the weight of unfinished truths. But she knew from that moment they weren't working just for now. They were trying to rewrite the future. A truly just society isn't one where every injustice is exposed. It's one where justice is so embedded that exposure becomes obsolete. Natalie knew that reality was still far off, but she also knew each person who turned back was a step closer. Lance didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply offered an act, and Natalie accepted it like a stone laid on the path they were building. One leading toward an America where every child, regardless of skin color, could grow up without fearing the lights flashing behind them. She left the cafe as dusk fell. Outside, streetlights cast long shadows through still branches, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Natalie clutched the folder tightly, her heart more steady than ever. Each page was a bell rung awake, and every person who turned back, like Lance, was living proof of the belief she held above all else. Justice is not a privilege. It's something you have to fight for and guard for today and tomorrow. And in the small, windowless room of the underground office, where the white walls had turned a dull shade and the flickering fluorescent lights gave the air an intentional harshness, Natalie and Audrey had spent night after night piecing fragments together across a battered wooden table, unraveling a maze woven from power, fear, and silence. The bulletin board was covered in a dense spider web of connections, each string linking photographs, each colored pin marking roles, levels of involvement, and the timeframes of tampered cases. With her razor-sharp legal mind, Audrey helped Natalie dissect layer after layer of sanitized language buried in official reports. Phrases like insufficient grounds for further action, resolved via special protocol, or adjusted due to personnel shifts. On their own, harmless. But placed side by side, they outlined a years-long campaign of quiet complicity. Among the names appearing on the web were those of long-respected senior officers, once held up as models of discipline and tenure. They had not directly abused or handcuffed the wrong people, but they had signed off. They had edited a line. They had recommended a shift change so someone wouldn't be held accountable. Late one night, while Audrey reviewed a list of 42 cases once marked closed, Natalie stood quietly by the window, where the city's lights in the distance flickered like distant thoughts. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about justice. She was thinking about something even more fragile: voluntary change, unforced, uncoerced, without vengeance. And then, unexpectedly, it arrived. The next morning, while Natalie was reviewing testimony from a frontline officer previously suspended for overreach, her assistant knocked, voice slightly shaken. "There's a group here asking to speak with you. They call themselves the Old Ones of the System." The team quickly cleared sensitive files from the room. Audrey stood in the corner, eyes locked on the door. When three older individuals entered, white-haired in crisp but badgeless uniforms, the air shifted. The first to step in was Martin DeWitt, once the commanding chief of West D.C., known for his tough but effective approach. Beside him, Gerald Stokes, the former deputy director of personnel, whose signatures appeared on hundreds of internal transfer decisions now under Natalie's review. The last was Francis Kincaid, a retired officer who had appeared in old academy photos with Natalie, her role never fully known. Martin spoke first, voice raspy and deliberate. "I know we're sitting on the wrong side of history." Natalie said nothing, not out of dominance, but because she knew if they had come here, they had already stepped out of their shadows. Gerald folded his hands on the table, voice low. "I used to think just doing my part was enough, but then I watched my wife, she teaches middle school, freeze when a young black girl was arrested right outside the school gate. No weapon, just a backpack and homework. Frances gently placed an envelope on the table. Inside were copies of transfer orders she had signed, alongside handwritten notes. I stayed silent when the numbers were changed. I didn't ask, afraid I'd lose my job. Now I'm more afraid I'll die without making it right. The room was still. Natalie looked at each of them, not to judge, but to measure sincerity. She had once told Audrey, "We'll know this battle is working when the ones who wrote the rules start asking how to fix them." Martin looked up. His voice had steadied. "I didn't come for forgiveness. I came to ask, what can I do to fix this?" Natalie glanced at Audrey. They both understood. This was not an offer of amnesty. It was a doorway. She nodded gently, as if accepting a promise left unspoken. "Then start by signing this statement. Voluntarily, publicly. Write down what you knew, what you saw, and what you chose not to question." Gerald reached first, taking the file. His hands no longer trembled. Frances followed, then Martin, signing last. His shoulders shook slightly as he put down the pen, but there was relief in his expression, like a door had opened from within, not by force from outside. As they left, Audrey whispered, "I've never seen this. Someone from inside the system is asking how to repair it." Natalie smiled softly, not with triumph, but with understanding. Justice doesn't only come when the oppressed rise up. It also comes when the privileged choose to step down. She turned back to the board. A new color had been added to the web, not just red for wrongdoing or blue for evidence, but yellow pins, marking those who stepped out of the gray and into the rebuild. She picked up a yellow pin and pressed it into the name, Martin DeWitt. Another stone was laid on a road she never thought would have company, and yet those who once sat it out, when they choose to rise, may be the loudest confirmation that change is not only possible, it has already begun. The sentence was handed down on a windy afternoon, the trees along Constitution Avenue rustling like they were marking the rhythm of a new chapter in judicial history. Inside the courtroom, there were no cheers, no uproar, just a silence so deep it seemed to settle in the bones. A silence one only feels when justice finally walks to the highest seat on its own. Wesley Grant, dressed in pale prison orange, stood frozen at the defendant's stand. His face had lost all color, lips pressed tight as if the last of his words were retreating from his throat. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 27 years in federal prison, the room remained quiet. But in the back row, an elderly woman gently gripped the hand of the person beside her, and across the aisle a young man lowered his phone to his lap, tears gathering in his eyes. They were the ones the system had once hurt, and now they watched that same system bow its head. But justice wasn't just in the punishment. It was in the exposure, and this time, light spared no corner. In the weeks that followed, the Monroe inquiry became the center of special legislative hearings. Hundreds of arrest records were reopened. Reports once marked sensitive were unsealed. Each flipped page revealed a distorted statement, a buried name, a truth once traded for fear or authority. Grant wasn't the only one brought to light. Dozens of officers, coordinators, prosecutors, and even administrative staff tied to approval chains were called to account. Some admitted guilt, others denied everything. But this time, the evidence was too vast, too clear. No one could whitewash what had long since become habitual misconduct. The judge, who had once sat in silence as Natalie was humiliated in open court, the silver-haired man whose name she never publicly spoke, submitted his resignation. In a letter to the entire judiciary, he wrote, "I believed silence was neutrality, but silence in the face of injustice is siding with power. I failed, not just as a judge, but as a citizen." His letter was printed in several major newspapers, not as a justification but as a public reckoning. Another signal is that when the light becomes strong enough, even those standing in the dark can no longer pretend not to see. Yet, one of the most haunting revelations came from Grant's personnel file. In a special interview with the inquiry team, a retired classmate of Grant's from the police academy revealed Wes used to be one of the good ones. I remember in 2009, he gathered evidence to expose a superior who was pressuring young officers to fabricate arrests just to meet quotas. Internal records confirmed it. The complaint was quietly closed within 5 days. The accused supervisor wasn't punished. Grant, then still a probationary officer, was transferred to a distant district. His career prospects stalled. A year later, his girlfriend, a journalist who wrote on police abuse, quit suddenly and moved out of the city. Another colleague close to Grant was arrested for drug possession, but the charges were later dropped without explanation. According to one internal source, that was the turning point. Grant stopped fighting the system. He chose survival. He became a keeper of its gears, anything to avoid becoming its next casualty. In his final interview before being transferred to federal prison, when asked why he joined the network of manipulation, Grant answered slowly, "I used to be good, but when you lose everything for doing the right thing, you start telling yourself, better to do wrong and live than be right and get crushed." When Natalie read the transcript, she didn't feel anger, but there was sorrow in her eyes, a recognition, as if looking into a version of herself from some alternate life, one that had stood at the same line of choice, only she had stepped to the other side. She didn't include Grant's story in her final report, but she kept a copy of his last statement. As a reminder, justice doesn't begin with sentencing. It begins with choice, and sometimes choosing not to resist what's wrong is how darkness gets its start. Leaving the detention facility that evening, Natalie stood under the awning as a light rain began to fall. The wind carried the bite of early winter. She didn't rush. Before her lay the names of those who had once looked away, enabled, or stayed silent out of fear. But now, doors within the system were creaking open, because some of those same hands were beginning to release the locks. Somewhere out there, in the narrow cracks of a system still running on old instincts, a slender beam of light had found its way in, not to erase the past, but to remind us, no matter how long the shadows, the right light can still reach the deepest place. Under the high ceiling of the Southeast Community Hall, pale fluorescent light fell onto rows of aging plastic chairs, crammed so tightly that it felt like even breath had to be rationed. This space had hosted countless anonymous meetings, debates over streetlight budgets, appeals for extra school lunch allocations. But this evening, it had become something else entirely, a space for voices that had been forced into silence to finally reclaim their true sound. On the low stage stood a plain wooden podium. No flag, no banners, just a faded green curtain with frayed hems. And yet, it was from that stage that voices long suppressed began to take shape again. Natalie didn't speak at this hearing. She chose a seat in the front row, pen in hand, notebook open, but still blank. Not because she had nothing to write, but because what she needed now wasn't to speak, it was to listen, to the truth, spoken not by officials or investigators, but by the ones who had lived beneath the machinery of skewed justice. Then a man with salt and pepper hair rose, no name tag, no introduction, holding a single sheet of paper folded into quarters, edges wrinkled from a trembling hand. "I'm Tom Whitley," he began, voice hoarse, like someone who rarely spoke up in front of strangers. "I have a son. He's a high school senior, was arrested last year for parking in the wrong spot near Chinatown. Cops asked to search the car. He refused. Nothing dramatic. Just said no. That's legal, right?" He paused. Then he was thrown to the ground, pinned to the curb. And I used to think this kind of thing only happened to black people. No one gasped. No one scoffed. because in this room no one had come to judge. They came to listen. Mr. Whitley continued, his eyes now glassy. I was wrong. I thought skin color decided who the police targeted, but now I understand. It's our silence, the silence of those who think they're safe, that let it go on this long. Toward the back, a middle-aged woman raised a hand to her mouth, not to stifle a sob, but to stop herself from saying something too soon. Next to her, a young man nodded softly, as if witnessing, for the first time, a white man naming a pain that had always belonged to his community. The hearing stretched late into the evening. No indictments were announced, no warrants issued, but every story shared, every once downcast gaze now lifted, was a kind of vindication, for the voices once strangled, for the mothers with no children left to call, for the fathers who had confused order with justice. When a retired officer stood before the very community he once profiled, admitting he'd judged them by skin tone alone, the entire hall stood in applause, not for him, but for the moment itself, the moment cracks in the system were finally being named. The truth was no longer hidden behind sanitized reports. Pain no longer pushed quietly into memory. Natalie wrote just one line in her notebook. Justice doesn't begin with indictments. It begins when people truly listen to each other. And as she rose to leave the room, no one blocked her path. No escort was needed, because from this moment on, she wasn't walking alone. She moved forward with the voices. Hundreds, once pushed to the margins, now echoing in the heartbeat of a country just beginning to learn how to repair itself. The small wooden house on the outskirts of Birmingham still carried the scent of old pine and the chipped white paint that had weathered through the years. Every creak beneath Natalie's feet on the hardwood floor rang out with the familiarity. Sounds that once lulled her to sleep on stormy southern nights, now echoing like the embrace of memory itself. Her mother was already waiting at the door, her eyes gentle, smoothing the hem of a freshly pressed dress. There were no grand greetings, just a short, heavy hug, enough to make Natalie feel like she'd returned from a war so long even time had stepped aside. On a wooden shelf in the corner of the living room, 2 framed photos remained exactly as she remembered, one of her father in his Marine uniform, the other showing him beside a schoolyard fence, gripping little Natalie's hand when she was just 6. His face was resolute, eyes fixed on the lens, not defiant, not fearful, just the gaze of a soldier who had stood in the crossfire and still believed that if anything was worth protecting, it was justice. Her mother gently touched the frame, as if trying to pass warmth through it. Your father used to say, "Not everyone in uniform understands the value of what they're guarding," she murmured. But he still believed that someday someone brave enough would change that. Natalie sat in the wooden chair by the window, where afternoon light spilled through old curtains, casting patterns across the uneven floor. The harsh years in Washington, the hearings, the anonymous threats, the smirks of those who once dismissed her presence in every briefing room, they all flooded back like a film, played in reverse, until they gathered into one breathless stillness. No more chants, no more flashing press lights. Just the wind rustling through the backyard trees and the slow ticking of the wall clock. In this place where nothing seemed to move, Natalie felt herself standing at a threshold more important than any courtroom she'd ever entered, the threshold of resolve. She looked out at the garden, where the old wooden fence had once marked the line between the safety of childhood and the world's harsh truths. Now, she was the one who had crossed that boundary, not through rage, but through irrefutable evidence, through a calm persistence that forced a system to look itself in the mirror. And more than anything, she had done it not just to reclaim justice for herself, but to give names once erased a rightful place in memory, in dignity. Natalie opened her notebook, flipping through the pages written for this long journey. Besides, notes from investigations and witness statements were named Deborah, Holloway, Jordan, Miles, Tom, Whitley, Each name is a stitch on the torn map of justice, a patch that needed to be seen, not hidden. She wrote one more line. There are still names left unspoken, and I will speak to them, one by one. As night fell, Natalie didn't turn on the lights. The moonlight streaming through the window was enough to reflect her face in the old mirror on the wall. It was no longer just the face of an FBI agent. It was the face of someone who had once been handcuffed in a place meant to protect her, and still chose to keep walking, not for pride, but for a promise. A promise to the father who believed America could do better. A promise to the mother who believed in her even when the system did not. And a promise to herself that justice isn't a destination, but a journey that demands courage with every step. The story of Natalie Price is not just the journey of an agent handcuffed in a courtroom. It's a declaration that justice is never a gift. It is a responsibility, one each generation must claim for itself. When the system fell silent, she chose to speak. When she was cast out, she quietly found her way back in. And when an entire city stood behind her, the truth was no longer buried beneath cold reports and sanitized lies. Justice begins with a voice once silenced, and spreads through the thousands who dare to carry it forward. And you, when injustice stands before you, will you stay quiet or be the first to rise? If this story moved you, hit like, share it, and subscribe. Let's keep telling the stories that make America look in the mirror and walk, step by step, toward something fairer.